Father in heaven, as we begin this study, we ask that you will open our ears to hear and that you will open our eyes to see. We want to do your will. We want to know where we are in the course of history because we need to prepare for that glorious event, the coming of Jesus and the passing through the time of trouble. So we ask that you will be with us, that your Holy Spirit will guide our thoughts. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. In previous studies, we noticed that Matthew 24 has a dual fulfillment. The first fulfillment was in the events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. The second application, or the second fulfillment, is when the events at the end of the world lead up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. However, a question surfaces now as we begin. Does Matthew 24 address the period between the destruction of Jerusalem and the events that lead up to the second coming of Christ? Or does Matthew 24 bypass the long period of Christian history between the destruction of Jerusalem and end-time events? As we have seen in a previous presentation, there is only one great tribulation divided into two parts, with a pause in between those two parts. The first part is from 538 to 1798 AD. It's the period of papal dominion. The second period is after the pause period ends, when the deadly wound of the papacy heals and the papacy behaves in the end time events as it did in the past. So the question is, does Matthew 24 address both of these periods? In a certain sense, we noticed already that Matthew 24 does. However, Matthew 24 appears to bypass, generally speaking, the period of church history between the destruction of Jerusalem and end-time events. It seems to focus primarily on the events that will take place after the pause period ends. However, in this lesson, we are going to notice that as we examine the parallel passage to Matthew 24 in Luke 21 and verses 20 and 21, this period of church history is very clearly addressed. This becomes clear when we compare Luke 21 and verses 20 and 21 with Daniel 7:25, Revelation chapter 12 verses 6 and 12, Revelation 13 verse 5, and Revelation chapter 11 and verses 2 through 6. So we're going to take a look at all of these passages to see how they relate to one another. And we're going to see that Luke does have a strong focus on the period of 1260 years when the papacy predominated primarily in Europe. So Matthew 24, as we examined this chapter, after the sign of the abomination of desolation, has four sequential signs. The first is the destruction of earthly Jerusalem. That's found in verses 15 through 20 of Matthew chapter 24. Then we have a second period, which is sequential to the first, and that is a period of severe tribulation. That's found in Matthew chapter 24 and verses 21 through 28. Then the third sequential point that we find in Matthew 24 after the abomination of desolation are signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that's found in Matthew 24 and verse 29. Finally, the fourth point that we have, sequential to the previous three, is the shaking of the powers in the heavens and the appearance of the sign of the Son of Man and the second coming. We find that in Matthew 24 and verses 30 and 31. So once again, you have four sequential events after the abomination of desolation. You have the destruction of earthly Jerusalem, a period of severe tribulation, signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and finally the shaking of the powers of the heavens, and the appearance of the sign of the Son of Man, and then the second coming of Jesus Christ. However, when we look at Luke chapter 21, we find that perhaps there are only 3 sequential signs rather than 4. And Luke 21 is the parallel passage. Let's notice those 3 sequential signs that are referred to in Luke chapter 21, beginning with verse 20. The first is the destruction of earthly Jerusalem. We found that also in Matthew 24. That's found in Luke chapter 21 and verses 20 through 24. The second point, sequential point in Luke chapter 21, is the signs in the sun, moon, and stars. And that's found in verse 25. And then the third sign that you find in Luke chapter 21, the third event, sequential event, is the shaking of the powers of heaven and the coming of the Son of Man, which is found in verses 25 and 26. So missing in Luke 21, it appears, is the sign of the Great Tribulation. However, we must ask, is the tribulation sign really missing in Luke chapter 21? As we shall see, the answer is no. Luke simply describes the tribulation sign differently than does Matthew chapter 24. We're going to find that Luke describes this tribulation period as the trampling of the holy city by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, we need to notice, first of all, that one thing is very, very clear in the first half of Luke 21 and verse 24. And that is that the first half of this verse is describing the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman legions that led to the destruction of the literal city of Jerusalem, the literal temple, and the exile of the literal citizens of Jerusalem to all nations. So Luke 21 verse 24, the first part of the verse deals with the destruction of literal Jerusalem. However, the second half of Luke chapter 21 deals with a different Jerusalem. Actually, Luke 21 and verse 24, the last half of the verse, is transitional. It describes a trampling of spiritual and symbolic Jerusalem. It describes spiritual and symbolic Gentiles. And it describes a symbolic period. So in other words, we're dealing with a different Jerusalem, a spiritual Jerusalem, spiritual Gentiles, and a symbolic time period. Let's read Luke 21 and verse 24. It says like this, "And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Now you notice that the first half of Luke 21 and verse 24 says, "And they will fall," this is a literal Jerusalem, "by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all nations." That is by the Romans. So now we find that the second half of the verse, "And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." And actually, I like the New Living Translation of the last part of the verse, where it says, "until the period of the Gentiles comes to an end." So what do we have here? What elements do we have here in the last half of Luke 21 and verse 24? We have Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until, this means that there's an ending point to the times of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles come to an end. So the times of the Gentiles have a beginning point and they have an ending point, although Luke does not mention the beginning or the ending point. We have to go elsewhere to find the beginning and ending point. In other words, Luke 21 and verse 24 speaks of two cities of Jerusalem, one literal and the other symbolic. It speaks about two tramplings of the city of Jerusalem, one literal and one symbolic. And it refers to two groups of Gentiles, one literal and the other symbolic. Lewis Weir, an Australian evangelist that lived primarily, his work was done in the 40s and early 50s, had a very interesting quotation that I want to share with you now. This is in his book, The King of the North at Jerusalem. This is a very important principle of prophetic interpretation. When passing over into the Christian era, there is an automatic transition from literal to spiritual Babylon, from literal to spiritual Jerusalem, from literal lands of Israel and Babylon to their spiritual antitypes. So up to the time of the stoning of Stephen, you're dealing with literal Jerusalem and you're dealing with literal Gentiles. Then, later on, after the establishment of the Christian church, you have the spiritual antitypes. Babylon is no longer literal. Jerusalem is no longer literal. Jerusalem refers to the Christian church, and the Gentiles refers to the papacy that persecutes God's people, as we will see in the course of our study. Now, when the second part of Luke 21, verse 24, describes the trampling of Jerusalem by the Gentiles, this is not referring to the literal city of brick and mortar. Jesus uses the word Jerusalem to refer to the people of the city. In other words, the trampling of the city in the second part of Luke 21 and verse 24 is dealing not with the trampling of a literal city of brick and mortar. It's talking about the people of the city that are trampled upon. I want to go first of all to a text in the Old Testament. This speaks about the first destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And you're going to notice that Nebuchadnezzar took all Jerusalem captive. It says there in 2 Kings chapter 24 and verses 14 and 15, also he carried into captivity all Jerusalem. So did Nebuchadnezzar take the walls of Jerusalem and the temple of Jerusalem and the city itself into captivity? No, not the brick and mortar, it's the people. So once again, and he carried into captivity all Jerusalem, all the captains and all the mighty men of the valor, the 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. So carrying Jerusalem into captivity means the people are carried into captivity. Jesus also considered Jerusalem, the word Jerusalem, to refer to the inhabitants of the city. Notice Luke chapter 19, verses 41 to 44. Here Jesus is coming down the eastern slope towards the Golden Gate of Jerusalem on the east side, and we find these words. Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace. He's not talking about the literal city of brick and mortar. He's talking about the people and their reaction to him. It continues, however, now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Obviously, the physical city of Jerusalem would not know the time of God's visitation because it's a city. It has no conscience. However, when Jesus says you did not know the hour of your visitation, he's talking about the people of Jerusalem. In Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39, once again, we find Jesus referring to Jerusalem as the people. So in the second half of Luke 21, verse 24, when it speaks about trampling Jerusalem, it's not talking about trampling the literal city of bricks and mortar. It's talking about trampling upon the people of the city. It says in Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39, Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets. Obviously, the brick and mortar did not kill anyone. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children, see, here's the people, your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, still speaking of the city, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So Luke 21 verse 24, the last half of the verse, is not speaking about the trampling of the literal city of Jerusalem by the literal Romans. It's talking about a spiritual Jerusalem, the people that are being trampled upon by a power that is referred to as the Gentiles. So now I want you to notice a very interesting verse that we find in Revelation 11 verse 2, which is parallel to Luke 21 and verse 24. And I want you to notice the relationship between Luke 21:24 and Revelation chapter 11 and verse 2 as well as verse 3. It says there in Revelation 11 verse 2 and 3, however, leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot 42 months. You remember that we find in Luke 21 and verse 24, 4 elements: Jerusalem, trampling, Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles come to an end. You'll notice that Revelation 11 verse 2 has the same elements. It speaks of the holy city being trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, and then it gives us the period. It doesn't say until the times of the Gentiles come to an end. It says for 42 months. So the 42 months are the times of the Gentiles of Luke chapter 21 and verse 24. So I want you to notice the parallel between Luke 21:24, the last half of the verse, and Revelation 11 and verse 2. You clearly have a parallel there, the same 4 parts. The holy city Jerusalem, trampling of the holy city Jerusalem, the Gentiles are doing the trampling, and the times of the Gentiles are the 42 months. And when the 42 months come to an end, the times of the Gentiles are finished. But then I want you to notice verse 3. Immediately after verse 2, where it speaks about the trampling of Jerusalem, Revelation 11 verse 2, we have another period that is mentioned, which is the same period expressed in different terms. It says there in verse 3 of Revelation chapter 11, and I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. So you'll notice that the 42 months of verse 2 and the 1,260 days of verse 3 are parallel. In other words, they refer to the same period. Now, we need to understand a very important principle in Bible prophecy, and that is that time periods in prophecy are symbolic. In other words, you apply the year-day principle. 1 literal day is equivalent to 1 literal year, which means that the 42 months are not literal 42 months. They actually are 42 months times 30 days each month, which is 1,260. So in other words, we're dealing with a 1,260 year period. That's the times of the Gentiles. That is what Revelation 11 verses 2 and 3 is referring to. So it says there in verse 3 again, and I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, that is years, clothed in sackcloth. Now, this is a very important point that I'm going to share in the next couple of minutes. John wrote Revelation 11 verse 2 at the end of the 1st century. In other words, he wrote this around the year 95 AD. 25 years earlier, the literal city of Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Roman legions. In other words, the literal city of Jerusalem and the literal temple had already been destroyed when John wrote Revelation 11, verses 2 and 3. In other words, literal Jerusalem had been in ruins for 25 years, and its inhabitants had already been taken into exile to the many nations. Thus, Revelation 11, verse 2, cannot refer to the literal destruction of literal Jerusalem in the year AD 70, because John in Revelation 11 verses 2 and 3 is speaking about a future desolation and trampling of Jerusalem. The literal Jerusalem had already been trampled and destroyed 25 years earlier. Now the question is, who are the Gentiles, and what is Jerusalem, or the holy city, in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 2? In a previous presentation, we saw that Jerusalem, during the Christian dispensation, refers to God's faithful church. And the Gentiles represent the enemies of God's faithful church. In other words, you're not dealing with literal Jews and you're not dealing with literal Gentiles. The literal Israel or Jerusalem represents the church, whereas the literal Gentiles represent the enemies of Christ's church. You can look at several Bible verses where this is proven. In Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 8. I'll just mention these because we've studied them before. Romans 2, verses 28 and 29. Galatians 3, 26 to 29, where we find that if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed. In other words, we are Israel if we are Christ's. John 4, 23 and 24, and John 8, 31 to 58 all show that those who are considered Israel or Jerusalem are the faithful people of God, the faithful church of God. The Gentiles are those who are enemies of God's faithful people. Now here's another important point. In Revelation 11 and verse 1, after the angel told John to measure the temple and those who worship in it, but not to measure the court, because the court was given to the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. This is very interesting because immediately after the times of the Gentiles, you have the measuring of the temple. It can't be the literal Jewish temple because it was destroyed. So this must refer to the heavenly sanctuary. It must refer to the heavenly temple. When John wrote the book of Revelation, Rome had already destroyed literal Jerusalem and the literal temple. And Israel had already been scattered among all of the nations. This means that the temple in Revelation 11 verse 1 is not the literal Jerusalem temple. It must be the temple of the Christian dispensation, the temple in heaven. And the worshipers in that temple must not be people who are literally worshiping in heaven, but by faith they are entering the heavenly temple where Jesus is interceding for his people. In other words, we are to understand the temple is the heavenly sanctuary, and the church spiritually is the earthly reflection of that temple. Now, let's notice something else that is very, very interesting. Now, before I go into this next point, I want to make sure that the previous point is very, very clear. That is, you have the times of the Gentiles, and then you have the measuring of the temple. So you have the 42 months or 1,260 years, and then after that you have the measuring of the temple. Now, I want us to notice something else. According to Revelation 11 and verse 2, the trampling of the city occurred for a period of 42 months. We already noticed that. And this period, as we noticed, is also described as 1,260 days. Now, this links the 42 months of verse 2 with the 1,260 days of verse 3. In other words, they're the same period, 42 months, 1,260 days. But now we need to notice something even further. Even further, it links Revelation 11, 2 and 3, where you have the 42 months and the 1260 days, with the 1260 days of Revelation 12, verse 6, and the 42 months of Revelation 13, verse 5. So I want you to notice that Revelation 11 in verse 2 and verse 3 refers to 42 months and 1260 days. But also Revelation 12 verse 6 refers to 1260 days, and Revelation 13 verse 5 refers to 42 months. In other words, Revelation 12 and 13 amplify Revelation 11 verses 2 and 3. So summarizing, the 42 months are in Revelation 11 verse 2. The 1260 days are in Revelation 11 verse 3. The 1260 days are also in Revelation 12 verse 6. And the 42 months are also in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5. So we have to study Luke 21 verse 24, the last part of the verse, with Revelation chapter 11 verses 2 and 3, with Revelation 12 verse 6, and Revelation 13 and verse 5. We have to link all of those together. Now, in order to understand Revelation 11 verses 2 and 3, we must not only go back to Revelation 12, and also verse 13, actually go forward to Revelation 12 and Revelation 13. But we also must go to the Old Testament roots of this particular prophecy. And the roots of the prophecy of Revelation 11, 2 and 3, as well as Revelation 12 and Revelation 13, are found in Daniel 7, verse 21 and 25, and Daniel 8, verses 11 to 13. In these verses, as we will notice, we're going to find a power, a little horn power, that tramples underfoot the temple of God and its true worshipers. This trampling of the temple and the worshipers in Daniel 7 and 8 does not refer to the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of the literal Jews at the hand of the Roman Empire, but rather to a rebellious little horn that introduced an idolatrous Christian worship that caused desolation after the breakup of the empire. Let's read Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25, where we find that this little horn blasphemed God, persecuted his people, thought he could change the law of God, and he ruled for 3.5 prophetic years. Let's read Daniel 7, verse 25. The little horn shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. So you notice here a little horn speaks pompous words against the Most High, persecutes the saints of the Most High, blasphemes the Lord, thinks that it can change times and God's law, and you have a time period. The saints are given into the hand of this little horn for times, and the dividing of time. Now, in order to understand Daniel 7:25, we have to look at the entire chapter, the sequence of powers in the entire chapter. If you notice, Daniel chapter 7 speaks of a lion that represents the kingdom of Babylon. Then you have a bear, the Medes and Persians. Then you have a leopard, Greece. Then you have a dragon beast, the Roman Empire. Then the dragon beast sprouts 10 horns. That was the division of the Roman Empire in the year 476. The barbarians invaded the empire and they divided the empire into 10 kingdoms. And then after the empire is divided, it's completely divided by 476, then the little horn comes up among the 10. And the little horn then does what we read in Daniel 7 and verse 25. And then notably after this, you have the beginning of the judgment in the heavenly temple. Very similar to Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 to 3. You have, first of all, the trampling of the holy city for 42 months, and then you have the measuring of the temple. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse, actually the end of the chapter, you have the little horn ruling for 1260 years, times and the dividing of time, and then you have a judgment scene. The judgment begins.